He opened the door to let in a friend. What walked in was history's sharpest betrayal. In a sunlit study in Mexico City, a man raised an ice axe. The blow that followed didn't just kill Trotsky, it split Latin America's conscience in two. This is the story of the exile who wouldn't be silenced, and the country that dared to shelter him. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lora. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The afternoon light in Coyoacán has a way of turning to gold just before it goes black. You could stand in the garden on Viena Street and hear Mexico City thrum beyond the walls, vendors calling, engines coughing, dogs whining, and then feel the hush descend like a velvet curtain. It was that hour, late on August 20th, 1940, when a man who once commanded an army of millions bent over a desk to read a familiar visitor's latest manuscript. In the study, the air was warm, the windows breathed, and the paper smelled of dust and ink. A hat and an overcoat rested oddly on a summer day. The visitor reached into that fabric, and history reached back. The ice axe lifted, the edge came down. This is the story of the Leon Trotsky assassination in Mexico City, the blow that ended a revolution's exile, and the riddle of why Mexico, of all nations, threw open its doors and then its police cordon to shield a man whom Joseph Stalin had sworn to erase. It is also a reckoning with the tricky question that lingers like smoke after a fire, whether that sanctuary and the murder inside it nudged Latin America toward peace or toward a deeper night. The facts are cold as steel. The telling must be warm as a human voice. So sit close to the flame. The wind is picking up. He was not always Trotsky. He was Lev Davidovich Bronstein of Yanovka, born on the Ukrainian steppe to Jewish farmers who read account books with the same seriousness as other men gave scripture. In Odessa and in Nikolaev, he found himself among students and young workers who spoke of overthrowing a czar so ancient that even his portrait seemed tired. He helped found the South Russian Workers' Union. The empire answered with iron and snow. In 1898, they sent him to Siberia, his first exile, a boy's face behind a grown man's sentence. He slipped the leash in 1902 and chose a new name from a forged passport, Trotsky, the way sailors choose a star, a direction, a destiny. London took him in. Iskra, the spark of a Marxist newspaper, handed him pages and purpose. There he shook hands with a compact, intense man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. There, he met the companion who would hold his hand at the end, Natalia Sedova. Revolution is a tide. It drags you out and throws you back. After the uprising of 1905, he returned to St. Petersburg and became the voice of the Workers' Council, the St. Petersburg Soviet. He spoke of a permanent revolution that would not stop at the borders of class or nation. The state heard that music, and again he went to Siberia, and again he escaped, and again he crossed Europe like a weather system. Austria, Switzerland, France, Spain, the United States. In New York, he tasted newsroom ink and subway grit. Then, in the winter of 1917, the February Revolution snapped the Romanov line like a dry branch. The man with the false name and the true hunger crossed an ocean back to a homeland that was being born in pain. Power, when it comes, is a kind of silence too. Doors open, rooms fill. People speak differently around you. Trotsky became People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and then Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs. The Red Army was his instrument, and he tuned it with iron. The Civil War in Russia lasted more than 3 years, a furnace fed with famine, typhus, and steel. Under his command, the Bolsheviks beat back a coalition called the White Army and the foreign hands that fed it. In those years, he defended coercive measures he would later loathe, argued over strategy and supply, and collided with a rising figure named Joseph Stalin. They grated like two blades in one sheath, clashing over authority, over who would breathe the air at the top of the mountain once the smoke cleared. After victory came the bitter harvest. Lenin's body failed, the party hardened. Trotsky, the theorist and the soldier, learned that power is never taken. It is held by fingers, by committees, by alliances that turn poisonous. He led the left opposition, warned against bureaucracy's frost, and wrote as if words could slow a machine. By 1927, he was expelled from the Central Committee. By the following year, he was out of the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan, then Turkey, then France, then Norway, each a way station on a road that seemed to curl toward the sea and end there. In August of 1936, the first show trials cracked like thunder over Moscow. Old Bolsheviks, Kamenev, Zinoviev, stood before lights and lies and were led out to die. Trotsky's name did not appear on the charge sheets, but a colder document had been drawn up elsewhere. Stalin judged him. Stalin condemned him. Norway, under pressure, put him under house arrest. Then a hand reached across an ocean, painted in intense colors. Diego Rivera, Mexico's giant of walls and pigment, petitioned President Lázaro Cárdenas to grant asylum to the exile the Kremlin wanted obliterated. It was not the first time Mexico opened its doors. Spanish Republicans fleeing fascism had already found refuge there, and Mexico's foreign policy had slowly shaped itself into a creed. We shelter the persecuted not as a favor, but as a duty. Another calculation mattered. Mexico and the Soviet Union had no formal diplomatic relations at the time. There would be no ambassador pounding on a desk, no embassy to withdraw in a fury. Cárdenas weighed the entreaties and the risks and said yes. He asked for one thing in return, a pledge of non-interference in Mexico's politics and foreign relations. Trotsky accepted. In January of 1937, Leon Trotsky and Natalia Sedova stepped onto Mexican soil. Coyoacán held them in its warm, complicated arms. At first, they stayed in the orbit of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, where art and argument ran hot through the rooms. Then Trotsky and Natalia settled on Viena Street, in a house with gardens and geese, a place that wore the morning sun like a shawl. He worked, wrote, received delegations, and debated the shape of Marxism after Stalin's turn. In Mexico City's electric nights, he could feel a second life beginning. He helped bring into being the Fourth International, a banner for those who would oppose Stalinism from the left. The Coyoacán house became a crossroads. André Breton, visitors from New York, students hungry for ideas, security men wary of shadows. Mexico had offered him a harbor, but the sea kept sending waves. Because Stalin does not forget, on May 24th of 1940, David Alfaro Siqueiros, a muralist with a soldier's past and a Stalinist's zeal, led armed men through the gates. Hundreds of bullets chewed wood and plaster, stitched the night with panic. Trotsky and Natalia lived through it as if by a trick of fate. Afterwards, the house changed. Walls thickened. Doors sprouted locks. Mexican police officers took turns at the gate. American bodyguards, bankrolled by sympathizers, learned the angles of every window. In Coyoacán, security grew like bougainvillea, vibrant, thorny, inescapable. Yet paranoia is a cage with gaps. The assassin came not through a breach in the wall, but through a door that seemed familiar. He called himself Frank Jackson. He had the hesitant confidence of a man used to being welcomed. His girlfriend, Sylvia Egloff, was known to the household. He brought pages to discuss and listen the way a student listens, with his head slightly bent. On that August afternoon, he arrived with a hat and an overcoat thrown over his arm, though the weather was fine. Natalia Sedova walked him to the study, closed the door, and left her husband to the ritual of generosity that had always defined him. Read the words, argue with the sense, treat ideas as living things. Then came a scream, and the life they had built in exile tipped into a tunnel of blood. The weapon was not a pistol. It was a mountaineer's ice axe, the kind used to bite into frozen slopes and save a man from sliding into a white abyss. Its head had two ends, a pick and an adze. The adze is the blunt, flat blade meant to chop steps in ice. That was the edge that came down on the right side of Trotsky's skull. The adze fractured the parietal bone and plunged 7 centimeters into the brain. He did not vanish into darkness at once. He staggered into the dining room, blood foaming his hair, and, this detail is not rumor, he found the breath to beg his guards to keep the attacker alive so he could speak and be known. The bodyguards wrestled the intruder to the floor. Natalia knelt in a river of red and held her husband's face as if the warmth of her hands could turn the wound back into skin. The Coyoacán police sent word to the Cruz Verde hospital at about 6 o'clock in the evening. An ambulance rattled to the house through the city's arteries, sirens singing, tires skidding. The paramedics saw a man they assumed was already beyond help and found, upon placing fingers on the throat, that the pulse still tapped under the skin. They lifted him with the care one uses for shattered glass and fled back into the traffic, carrying not a symbol, not an ideology, but a broken human head. In the house, Natalia's cries were left to echo. In the ambulance, a plan formed itself around oxygen, gauze, and speed. Before the ambulance arrived, his personal physician had been fetched. Wenceslao Dutram Dominguez, a Spanish exile like so many who had befriended Trotsky in Mexico. Dutram had practiced medicine and pharmacology in Barcelona and lent his talents in calmer years to a tonic called Erotil, sold for the ailment men rarely mention in daylight. He examined Trotsky on the floor of the study and noted that the left hand and arm had gone slack and that the right hand's movements were clumsy and delayed, the body already unequal to itself. In such medicine, there is no heroism, only triage, a grim arithmetic. Dutram waited with Natalia for the siren to arrive and knew, as doctors know, what he would not say. Cruz Verde Hospital stood at the corner of Victoria and Revillagigedo streets. When the ambulance doors flew open, a team had coalesced as if conjured. At the center was Joaquin Mas Patiño, a neurosurgeon from Hospital Juárez, among the first in Mexico to carve a specialty out of the skull's dark theater. With him stood Ruben Leñero Ruiz, young, brilliant, already the city's director of medical services and the founder of the Mexican Society of Trauma. A man of medicine arrived not in a white coat but with the charge of state, Gustavo Baz Prada, rector of the National Autonomous University, sent as the eyes and will of President Cardenas, who would later call this murder the dirtiest crime committed on Mexican soil. Nearby watched Jacinto Segovia, a Spaniard who had once taught surgical pathology in Madrid before the Civil War pushed him here. Surgeon Everardo Garcia Espino and anesthesiologist Salvador Mendez completed the circle. The doors to the operating room closed. First came the image. X-rays mapped chaos. Then came the knife. They shaved his hair and opened a window in the skull, 25 square centimeters, bone folded back like a lid, to find the parietal bone shattered into horse teeth fragments, meninges torn, brain tissue bulging through. Mass did what a neurosurgeon can do when a foreign blade has tilled the head like a field. Take out the bone splinters, cleanse the tract, pray against infection, fight edema, watch the brain swell against the prison of itself. He had once written that stopping encephalic bleeding is a fool's errand, that living tissue once loosed can pour on beyond human control, and that the surgeon must not add surgical shock and anesthetic intoxication to a wound that is already an argument with death. He did what he could. At 10 o'clock that night, they moved their patient from the bright cold of the theater to a room where air comes and goes, and a person begins a vigil. Leñero ordered oxygen. Nurses were told, no unnecessary punctures. Do not worsen the shock. President Cardenas's representative spoke to the press with a frankness that matched the hour. 90% chance of death, said Baz. Segovia was no longer hopeful. Across a border, Trotsky's allies scrambled for a miracle, asked Johns Hopkins if Dr. Walter Dandy, the master of the brain, founder of a team whose name carried its own legend, could be flown to Brownsville and ferried to Mexico City. Arrangements began to take the shape of a plan. On the bed, Trotsky's breath hitched and rattled in his chest. The plan would not matter. Some wounds you can outrun, others you must endure. This one was both an injury and a sentence. Morning found him adrift. He did not return to consciousness. Physiological serum and oxygen were administered. However, the numbers did not rise. By midday, a grim observation entered the chart. The ventricles were flooding with blood. In the afternoon, breathing turned fast and wrong, the body thrashing in slow motion against a tide. Natalia was told. Around 6 o'clock in the evening of August 21st, the written word hardened. Critical. The temperature is 38.1 degrees Celsius, pulse 140, breathing 41, blood pressure, right arm 78 by 68, left arm 78 by 64, a diagnosis in ink, flooding of the cerebral ventricles, an extremely severe injury that darkens the prognosis. At 7:25 in the evening, 25 hours and 35 minutes after the ad's cracked bone and pierced brain, his pulse collapsed. The injection of adrenaline found nothing to seize, and the doctors drew the line under a life. Natalia's hand did not let go. It simply had nothing left to hold. In the morning of August 22nd, they took him to the Alcazar funeral home downtown. At 2 in the afternoon, the casket opened in the embalming room. The Cruz Verde gown clung to the body. Blood dripped still from the bandages as if the night were refusing to end. Gathered in that sterile place were surgeons José Rojo de la Vega and José Edmundo Sol, Erasmo Marin, the city's medico-legal director, embalmers Arturo Orozco and Francisco Ortega, Dr. Mas, and José Luis Núñez, the chief of police. The man in charge was de la Vega, surgeon to bullfighters of the Plaza Mexico, whose fame had been carved in the urgent minutes when a horn opens a man and time is measured in spurts of red. He opened the scalp, rolled it back, and exposed the skull. There was a hole 3 centimeters across in the right parietal bone, 4 centimeters off the midline, 12 centimeters above the right eyebrow. He removed the skull cap and lifted the brain into his hands. A subdural hematoma pressed like a storm at sea. In the right hemisphere, a wound 2 centimeters wide, 7 centimeters deep, penetrated toward the lateral ventricle, which was drowned in blood. The path ran high across the second parietal convolution, above the curved fold of the Rolandic fissure. The clinical signs of the previous evening, the left hand and arm gone still, made new sense. The damage likely struck the motor neurons of the precentral gyrus. However, compression from the acute bleed could have written the same terrible signature. The trajectory told its own story, downward, backward, from right to left. The assassin had stood face to face and struck from the front. The cerebellum and medulla were pale from loss. The hemispheres were weighed, 780 grams for the left, 770 for the right, a total of 1,550 grams. Numbers, facts, measurements, brittle rails laid down to carry sorrow safely away from collapse. Afterwards, they closed him. The body was set out. Thousands filed past in Mexico City's heat. Workers, students, artists, policemen, eyes low, mouths tight. Plans were floated to take the remains to the United States. Washington declined. It feared the dead. After days of watching, they cremated him. The ashes were brought home to the garden on Viena Street, set inside a monument within sight of where the blow had fallen. If you go today to the Leon Trotsky House Museum in Coyoacán, the geese mutter in the morning, and the trees lift their hands toward the sky, and the ashes do not speak. It is the house that tells the story now. High walls, iron gates, guard towers, the architecture of a sanctuary that knew it was a target. Who was the man on the floor that night, bound and battered, with a false passport and a borrowed life? He was not Frank Jackson of Canada. He was not the Belgian Jacques Mornard. He was Jaime Ramón Mercader del Rio Hernández, a Spanish communist with strings tied to the Soviet secret police, the old GPU, and the NKVD's more extended arm, threading agents through Europe's fissures. He confessed little, never enough for the whole shape of his orders to be nailed to a wall. Mexico imprisoned him in the Palacio de Lecumberri for 20 years. When he stepped back into sunlight, he found his way to Cuba, then to the Soviet Union, where a medal as obscene as a grin awaited him. Hero of the Soviet Union. He died in 1978 and lies in Kuntsevo Cemetery, a stone's throw from the power that had raised and unmade so many men. Natalia remained in Mexico for as long as her life allowed, pacing rooms that kept her husband's books and his silence. Later, she went to Paris, died there in 1962, and returned in ash to the garden where their memories already lived. In Moscow, the machine that had sentenced Trotsky in all but name continued to grind. In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev, by then the last leader of a state Trotsky had once imagined as a beginning, condemned him once more in the old terms. 4 years later, that state collapsed, a fallen colossus. It is said, not by prophets but by men who read the minutes, that Trotsky had warned all his life of the death that bureaucracy carries in its pockets, that a revolution that forgets its people will turn itself inside out until capitalism walks in wearing a new suit. He died by neurotrauma, yes, the surgeon's Latin for an opened head. He died also by hatred and revenge, by a regime's terror that ideas might outlive prisons. Now we draw the circle back to Mexico and ask again why this country sheltered him. The answer is a braid. There is the moral strand. President Cardenas presided over a government that believed asylum to be a principle of foreign policy, not a spectacle. Mexico had already received shiploads of Spanish Republicans. It had taken stands that cost it the favor of powerful friends. There is the political strand. When Trotsky was admitted, Mexico and the Soviet Union had no formal diplomatic relations to imperil. There was no ambassador to be called home in fury, no theater of offended protocol to stage. There is the personal strand. Diego Rivera, with his eye for muscular allegory, pressed Trotsky's case. Frida Kahlo opened house and heart. Mexican intellectuals and labor leaders lifted their voices. And there is the legal strand. Trotsky swore publicly and plainly that he would not intervene in Mexican politics, that his pen and his voice would not be used to embarrass his hosts or entangle them abroad. Protection, however, is never perfect when empires take an interest in you. After Siqueiros's assault, the state tightened its net. More police, more sandbags, more watchfulness. Yet the success of the second attempt confirms a truth older than walls. The most dangerous door is the one you open yourself. Mercader walked through with a manuscript and a love affair, and the slow patience of a man instructed to wait until waiting is all that is left to do. Mexico did not fail Trotsky. Mexico did what it promised, gave refuge, afforded security, upheld a principle. The wound did not come from outside the promise. It came from the point where trust humanizes a fortress and therefore weakens it. What did this mean for Latin America's future? Some things did not change at all. The Cuban Revolution, born in 1959 of Sierra Maestra grit and Havana's twilight, was not a Trotskyist uprising, but a Cuban one that later embraced the Soviet orbit for sugar and survival. The guerrillas who followed, FARC in Colombia, rising in 1964 from peasant self-defense and Communist Party roots, the ELN with its own Cuban inspiration, Sendero Luminoso in Peru, a Maoist storm wholly its own, were products of local soils, unequal lands, oligarchic states, rural abandonment, and ferocious counterinsurgencies. Trotsky, living or dead in Mexico, did not plant those seeds. If anything, his presence nourished a current within Latin American leftism, small, brilliant, argumentative, that took his name, printed journals, and fought long ideological battles against Stalinist parties powerful in unions and universities. The existence of Trotskyist groups across the region was, in part, the effect of a symbol being near enough to visit, to write to learn from. But symbols sharpen knives only when hands already crave their edges. On the right, the response took the shape of iron. Operation Condor in the Southern Cone, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, bound juntas into a hunting pact in the 1970s and 1980s, an agreement stitched with intelligence files and a doctrine that called repression salvation. Condor was born of generals, of barracks fear, of the cold arithmetic of a superpower confrontation. A Trotsky alive to write more would not have stayed the hands of men who believed they were saving Western civilization by throwing bodies out of airplanes over the River Plate. Nor would his silence from the grave have dissuaded Washington from treating the hemisphere as a chessboard. The trigger for Condor was not a Marxist theorist's survival or death. It was a sequence of coups, a doctrine, and the grim logic of the Cold War. And yet Mexico's Asylum told the region something about itself. A country bruised by revolution and pinned between giants decided that its dignity lay not in pleasing the strong, but in sheltering the hunted. That ethic did not die with Trotsky. It reappeared when Chileans fled the stadiums of Santiago, when Argentines slipped the net of the junta, when Salvadorans and Guatemalans ran from the teeth of death squads. The house in Coyoacán served as a parable. A state can be both compassionate and vigilant, can hold a principle and a rifle at the same time, can accept the danger of conscience as the price of calling itself civilized. There is a larger counterfactual that reaches beyond the garden on Viena Street. The heaviest toll of 20th century communism fell not under Lenin, but under Stalin. The forced collectivization, the famines of the early 1930s, the great purge's machinery of accusation and ash. Had Trotsky prevailed after Lenin's death, had the party remained less suffocated by bureaucracy, some of that darkness might have been blunted. Millions of lives could have been saved inside the Soviet Union. That did not happen, but to the extent that Latin America's left and right took their cues from Moscow's authority and example, a Soviet story that curved toward less horror might have translated into movements less desperate and regimes less murderous. This remains speculation held at a respectful distance. The soil here is its own law. Havana's missiles, Ayacucho's highlands, Santiago's stadiums, their histories were not waiting for a Muscovite signature. They were already moving. Still, Trotsky's presence in Mexico and his death by an ice axe left marks you can touch. In art, the revolution's soul was argued not on a Kremlin balcony, but on the walls of Mexico's muralists and the pages of Spanish-language journals. In politics, the idea of permanent revolution found echoes in classrooms and unions, even as Stalinist parties threw shade at the very name. Insecurity, the assassination forced Mexico to reckon with the costs of its creed. To protect the persecuted is to invite the persecutor's attention. The state responded with a combination of pride and vigilance, police patrols, public statements, and a grief that felt like ownership. Trace the line from Cardenas's yes to the guards at the gate in Coyoacán and onward to later passports granted to exiles. It is the story of a country learning to carry compassion and caution in the same hand. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.